Welcome to the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host, Tom Mason, and today is part 2 of Tom's Sculpting Archives, year 2007. Now we enter my work for the Dead Generals Society. This is a really cool group of guys and gals. It was a large group. There was actually a lot of partners, and I worked with a few different people over the years. But this character is the Swordsman. Now I don't have greens for this, or I believe any of the other. I might have some of the later ones, but none of these early ones. In the early stages of working with Dead General Society, they were very particular about everything. They wanted to keep all the greens, full ownership. They actually paid extra to do that, and they were really great to work with. I mean, they were a bit demanding, but in a good way, because they were very clear about what they wanted, so you weren't ever guessing on what needed to be done. And yeah, so this first one, the Swordsman. He was kind of a samurai, human. I can't remember if they were elves or not, but DGS was always really good about giving concept art that showed exactly the pose they wanted. So this is where I started doing a lot more consistent work, and this was a great client, very consistent, and it really forced me to have to start to learn to do more intricate things with parting and whatnot, because unlike working with Reaper, some of the other guys who wanted interesting and cool figures, they understood production a little more, and so they wanted stuff to be a single piece. But these guys, they were just really passionate gamers that were building this really big, epic world, and they wanted the miniatures to be just like they wanted them to be. So, humans were this size, elves were another size, and even if it was, a half millimeter difference, we would try and tackle that. The next miniature I did for DGS was the Chakram Pirate. This is like a really interesting lizardman character with all sorts of fun details and whatnot. And this, I'm trying to remember, I had done a couple weird things, for Magnificent Egos and whatnot, but this was a challenge just because it was very humanoid, but it had some very distinct elements to it, with the neck and head, and so I hadn't had a lot of practice trying to do things like that, where they weren't as formulaic. Interesting fun fact about this guy. So almost all of these DGS miniatures that I'm going to show you as time marches on, almost none of them were used, because DGS was hiring these sculptors, banking up these sculpts. They wanted them a very certain specific way, and then they realized, this is so different than what everybody else is doing scale-wise, that they were, afraid, rightfully so, that it wouldn't do well in the market. And so they started having people resculpt them. I even got to redo a few of the ones I did also. But this miniature, because of the size and bulk and just proportions, they were able to keep and use. And I believe it's still for sale to this day in their Free Blades game. The next miniature I got to do for Reaper Miniatures was another Warlord miniature, and it went along with the Dwarf Sapper, or Miner as they ended up renaming him. And I got to do this really fun Dwarf Miner Sergeant. This is probably my favorite sculpt I ever did for Reaper. There's several that are up there, but I just loved doing this one, and this was one of the very first miniatures I did, where when I completed it, I thought, this is perfect. There's nothing different I would want to change, because invariably any miniature or sculpt I did, I would always have a lot of regrets. Maybe I got rushed in the end, or I just wasn't able to achieve a certain look or technique the way I thought I wanted to. But everything came out perfect. There's a lot of fun little details on here too that just look great. Little canteen on the side here. I think this is a little, maybe some sort of blasting powder pouch or mug thing. He's got little bottles, vials, fun little pouch, and I just poured myself into this miniature, and it's just such a cool looking dwarf. I love doing this. I think I felt like, you know, I was finally getting green stuff, and I could do anything, and but unfortunately that feeling didn't last. But I'm really pleased with this miniature, and I got to do several more dwarves because of this as well. Enter Procreate. So I believe it was the year before I sculpted this miniature, I had been given the sample of Procreate sculpting putty from, I don't know, I think it was actually the Craftmark guys at the Sculptors meetup. And Reaper Ron gave me my very first Dark Heaven commission, which was to do a classic Dracula vampire. So I think it turned out very well. I like especially some little things like his hand here. It's really cool looking how it's gripping that cape and everything. The cape itself is pretty thick and bulky, which isn't always bad, but it's just a little, I think I could have made it a little more better and interesting. Now, here's a big thing that I had when first starting out and learning with Procreate, and it could have been because my Procreate at this point was a little old. I don't think I had really sculpted with it much at all until this miniature, but you see all these little pits. You know, whenever you sculpt with putty, there's a chance to get air bubbles pretty easily trapped underneath, just because it's such a dense material, and you know, air can't really escape very easily, so it gets trapped underneath. Well, for whatever reason, when I was working with this stuff, it was way worse than Procreate at first, and part of that was probably just me understanding and knowing techniques of how to deal with it. You know, it was, even though it's very similar to green stuff, it is slightly different, and so, you know, it kind of worked. You know, Dracula probably would have a more pristine cape, but in some ways it just kind of looks like little rips and tears, which might be possible. But this was kind of the bane of my existence for a few figures. This actually, coincidentally, this was, I believe, one of my very first sculpts where I did integrated bases. I had done a couple before, but I didn't want to do a typical broccoli base that Reaper usually has people do for their sculpts. So I did a little fun little flagstone or rock. So I didn't show the original green of my very first Reaper miniature because I got a commission to do a conversion. Reaper is really big and smart about using existing sculpts and having them modified to make a new miniature. That it saves them a lot of money because the fees for doing conversion stuff like this is way cheaper, and you know, it's a quick turnaround for the sculptor too. It gives them a chance to, you know, get more output. So I like how these turned out. It was a bit of a challenge because I had never taken an existing miniature, chopped them up, and tried to like keep as much as possible. So like, you know, I kept the boots, basically trimmed off all of this thigh part here, and then repositioned it around. And you can tell, it's probably a little tough to tell, but this is much darker there. But then this foot part and that thigh, that's a little lighter, and that's because that's the more recent green stuff. It's not, you know, this other green stuff has been baked twice. So, and I redid his mouth and beard a bit too, just to, you know, give him a slightly different looking face. But the majority of this miniature is the same original piece that I did, just kind of tweaked and posed around a bit more. I don't think this backpack goes to him. Yeah, that's a different guy's backpack. Ended up doing a lot of, basically I would do one version of a grunt and then usually get to do a second one, or sometimes a grunt became a sergeant. Whoops. So, yeah, so you can get a pack of this guy and the original from Reaper still. I think it's like 5 each or something for doing little army builds. Back on to more DGS miniatures. This is the Simcar Assassin. And as before, I don't have a green for it because they kept all those. But something that occurred to me, I totally forgot that in the original commissions of all these DGS figures that they had me do in integrated bases. And I had no memory of this. I guess it's because the more recent sculpts I did didn't have that. They went to slotted tabs and decided to use plastic bases just for a little more consistency. But I think they ended up having us do these integrated bases at first because this was starting out. They were basically building an RPG world and a war game kind of together, and they were supposed to. There were these two separate entity or games, but they were going to have it all. It's this big, massive world, and so they came from an RPG background. And obviously, a lot of those miniatures had these sort of integrated bases. But as you know, it's most of you might know that when you're doing war games, it's very helpful to have consistent bases, whether they're plastic or MDF. But this is a fun, quick little miniature. He had a little bit of tricky parts because I had to make his two individual hands separate so he would cast. But other than that, pretty straightforward. Another miniature I sculpted for DGS was the Erdogar Mystic, and this was a really fun miniature sculpt. This might even have been my very first female miniature. So I spent a lot of extra time just trying to get things right because I basically only done men. I grew up on superhero comics, and that's always what I wanted to sculpt, were these, the X-Men and Batman, stuff like that. So I never really did many females, and so it was a bit of a challenge, especially because this figure was on the smaller side. I think they called it out to be about 28 millimeters overall height, which by this point I think I was doing, like 30 millimeters to the eyes, or even 35 millimeter. It kind of varied based on the manufacturer, but it was typically kind of that more larger heroic scale, and so this being such a fine, it's a very slender miniature to begin with, and then it's supposed to be female. It was a challenge, but I think it turned out really well. And I'll have to see. I can't remember if this is one that I ended up getting to resculpt. I think it was, so I guess we'll find out in the future.
Thanks for watching another edition of Tom's Sculpting Archives. I hope it helped you see and understand just how you can develop over a year and over years as you watch the other archives from before and the ones I'm going to do in the future. Because in the end, what you really got to do is keep sculpting.